The solar flare warnings lit up Nora's monitoring station in cascading amber alerts, each one more insistent than the last. She'd been stationed on Kashari 7 for 6 months now, long enough to develop a healthy respect for the planet's volatile star and the electromagnetic chaos it could unleash without warning. Her fingers moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency, initiating shutdown protocols for the external relay arrays. The deep space communications equipment she maintained was sensitive enough to pick up whispers from across the galaxy, which made it spectacularly vulnerable when Kashari's sun decided to throw tantrums. The research station wasn't much to look at, a prefabricated structure half buried in the hillside for protection against radiation. Nora called it home in the way people do when the alternative is thinking too hard about being the only human for several thousand kilometers. Her job was essential, keeping the relay network operational for the colonial expansion effort, but it was also profoundly solitary work. She'd volunteered for it after her previous assignment ended badly, after relationships and complications made the idea of isolation seem appealing rather than daunting. That optimism had lasted about 3 weeks before loneliness became her constant companion. She talked to herself now, narrated her actions like she was teaching an invisible class. And here we see the human in her natural habitat, checking radiation shields for the 15th time because paranoia keeps you alive on hostile worlds. The station's AI didn't count as conversation, no matter how sophisticated its responses. It was just her equipment, and the knowledge that the nearest human settlement was a 2-week journey when weather permitted. Through the observation window, Kashari's forests glowed with their characteristic bioluminescence, trees that generated their own light in patterns that shifted with the seasons. Beautiful and completely alien, evolved on a world where conventional photosynthesis was impossible under the dim red sun. The Kashari people had built their entire civilization in harmony with these forests, creating settlements that looked grown rather than constructed. Nora had seen them from a distance, tall figures moving through the glowing trees with fluid grace. The official protocols were clear: maintain respectful distance, avoid direct contact unless absolutely necessary, and remember that humanity was a guest on this world. The Kashari had agreed to allow human research stations in exchange for technology transfers, but that agreement came with strict boundaries. Both species kept to their designated territories, and everyone pretended this was sustainable diplomacy rather than institutionalized avoidance. The solar flare struck with less warning than predicted. One moment Nora was securing the last external array, the next her screens filled with radiation alerts and electromagnetic interference that turned her carefully maintained systems into expensive static generators. She swore creatively, cycling through emergency backups and watching them fail one after another. The storm was stronger than forecasted, and she was going to be completely cut off until it passed. That's when she heard the pounding on the exterior airlock. Her first thought was debris. The storm could tear loose equipment and send it flying. Her second thought, when the pounding came again with desperate rhythm, was that she might be hallucinating from isolation. Her third thought was interrupted by a voice barely audible over the electromagnetic screaming, definitely not human and definitely not supposed to be here. Nora moved to the airlock's view panel, but external cameras were already offline. The pounding continued, increasingly frantic, and she made a decision that was either compassionate or catastrophically stupid. She opened the outer door. Radiation-charged wind hit the airlock chamber, carrying particles that made her sensors scream warnings. In the doorway, collapsed against the frame, was a figure that was unmistakably Kashari, tall and lean with the elongated proportions of a species evolved under different gravity. His clothing was scorched, his normally elegant posture reduced to exhausted desperation. Nora didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, carefully mindful of potential physiological differences, and pulled him into the airlock. He stumbled across the threshold, and she sealed the outer door, cutting off the storm's fury. The sudden quiet was startling after the chaos. Nora initiated decontamination protocols, watching the Kashari man steady himself against the wall. His large eyes, adapted for Kashari's dim light, struggled with the station's brighter illumination. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, with a characteristic graceful build that made his species look fragile until you remembered they'd evolved on a world that considered survival a daily challenge. He looked at her directly, and his entire body went rigid. Not fear exactly, but profound shock, like he was seeing something that shouldn't exist. They stood frozen in the airlock, decontamination mist swirling around them, and Nora realized this was probably his first close encounter with a human. All those protocols about maintaining distance meant neither species had much real experience with the other. She raised her hands slowly, palms out in what she hoped translated as non-threatening. "You're safe here," she said, keeping her voice gentle. "The storm can't reach you now." He didn't respond, just stared at her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every human feature that must look wrong to him. Her forward-facing eyes, her compact build, her flat face compared to his elongated features. She was probably as alien to him as he was to her. The decontamination cycle completed, and Nora opened the inner door, gesturing him into the station's main area. He moved with visible caution, his eyes tracking everything, cataloguing details like he was preparing a report on human habitats. Nora pulled out her emergency medical kit, pointing to the burns visible through his torn clothing. She held up supplies in question. He looked at the medical equipment, at her, at the sealed door keeping the solar storm outside. Finally, he extended his injured arm with the weariness of someone accepting help from a potentially dangerous source but having no better options. Nora cleaned the burns with antiseptic, trying to be gentle while being thorough. She had no idea if human medical supplies would work on Kashari physiology, but the alternative was doing nothing while he suffered. He watched her work with unwavering attention, like he was memorizing every detail. She applied synthetic skin, a spray-on bandage that had saved her numerous times, and stepped back to give him space. He examined the bandage with delicate precision, then looked at her and spoke. His voice carried harmonic overtones that made it sound like singing rather than speaking. Nora caught exactly none of it. She gestured to her translator unit, shook her head apologetically. The electromagnetic interference had killed all non-essential systems. His expression shifted to something that transcended species barriers, universal frustration at technology failing during critical moments. They resorted to gestures and pointing. Nora touched her chest. "Nora." He repeated it carefully, the syllables strange in his mouth. "Nora." "Close enough." She nodded encouragingly. He touched his own chest, spoke a word that sounded like wind through crystal chimes. "Tavriel." Nora tried, probably mangling the pronunciation completely. His head tilted in what might have been approval or resigned acceptance. He gestured to the storm still raging outside, then to himself in a traveling motion, finally pointing to her station with what looked like gratitude mixed with confusion. So he'd been caught in the storm, sought shelter in the nearest structure, and ended up in a human research station having his first close encounter with a species his people had been avoiding his entire life. Nora could relate to the absurdity. She showed him the station's basics through demonstration. The food synthesizer, the water reclamation system that made Kashari's mineral-heavy atmosphere precipitation drinkable, the small sleeping area separated by a privacy screen. Nora pulled out meal packs, held up two varieties in question. Tavriel examined them with visible uncertainty but selected one, hunger apparently overriding caution about human food compatibility. They sat in the main room, sharing a meal in awkward silence punctuated by the storm's continued assault on her station. Nora tried not to stare, but it was difficult when he was the first non-human she'd interacted with at close range in months. His ears, subtle and close to his head, moved constantly, tracking sounds beyond her hearing range. His eyes, large and luminous, reflected the station's lights with an almost liquid quality. His fingers were longer than hers, each movement precise and deliberate. He caught her staring, and Nora felt heat rise in her face. But instead of offense, Tavriel seemed equally curious, leaning forward to examine her with the same attention. He reached out slowly, his fingers hovering near her face in silent question. Nora held still, not sure what cultural significance this might have but willing to trust his obvious caution. He touched her cheek gently, his expression suggesting fascination mixed with confusion. His fingers traced her jawline, and Nora realized he was mapping the differences between human and Kashari facial structure. The translator flickered briefly to life, offering fragments before dying again. Never seen, so close, different from stories. The signal cut out, but Nora understood. Reality was different from whatever his people told about humans. She knew that feeling. Human settlements had plenty of stories about the Kashari, most painting them as hostile to contact. But the person sitting across from her seemed more curious than threatening, more uncertain than hostile. They spent the next hours in halting communication, part gesture, part drawing on her datapad, part waiting for the translator to offer brief windows of actual language. Nora learned that Tavriel was an environmental data collector, documenting the planet's bioluminescent patterns and ecosystem changes. They were doing similar work, maintaining their respective people's knowledge bases, keeping careful distance because their cultures insisted that was proper. He'd been traveling to a research site when the solar flare intensified beyond predictions. Apparently, Kashari forecasting wasn't perfect either. He'd sought her station because it was closest and he was desperate. Seeing a human up close was shocking because Kashari cultural practice involved maintaining distance from other species, a tradition rooted in ancient conflicts with other worlds. Morning came with unfamiliar sounds filtering through Nora's consciousness. Soft harmonic breathing that wasn't quite human, rhythmic and musical in a way that suggested Kashari respiratory systems worked differently than hers. She opened her eyes to see Tavriel still resting on the floor padding she'd offered him, his long frame arranged in a position that looked uncomfortable but that he seemed perfectly adapted to. The solar activity monitors still showed elevated readings, meaning they'd be sharing space for at least another day. Tavriel's eyes opened without the gradual process humans experienced, instant alertness that suggested his species treated sleep as strategic rest rather than vulnerable oblivion. He looked at her, at the station's interior, and his expression cycled through momentary confusion before memory clearly caught up. Nora held up the coffee maker in question, realizing immediately that he'd have no context for the gesture. She pantomimed drinking, pointed to herself, then to him in offering. His head tilted, and he made a gesture with his hands that she interpreted as acceptance. The translator chose that moment to flicker more reliably to life as the electromagnetic interference lessened. Your morning ritual involves heated beverages. Tavriel's voice came through in accented but clear translation, the harmonic undertones still present but comprehensible now. Nora nearly dropped the coffee container in surprise at hearing actual words. Coffee, she said, holding up the dark liquid. It's a stimulant. Helps humans wake up. I have no idea if it's safe for Kashari physiology, though. She hesitated, suddenly aware that she might be offering him something toxic. Tavriel reached for the cup carefully, his longer fingers wrapping around it with delicate precision. He brought it to his face, scenting it with the thoroughness of someone analyzing chemical composition through smell alone. We have similar preparations from forest lichens. The molecular structure seems compatible. He took a careful sip, his expression shifting through several emotions that Nora couldn't quite interpret. Bitter. Intense. I understand why you need this to achieve consciousness. Nora laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. That's the most accurate description of coffee I've ever heard. She poured her own cup, and they sat together in the station's small common area, drinking in comfortable silence that felt less awkward than the previous night's uncertainty. The storm will continue through today, Tavriel said, checking the monitors with the ease of someone who understood meteorological data regardless of species-specific interfaces. Perhaps longer. I apologize for the imposition on your solitude. Honestly. Nora surprised herself with her honesty. It's the most interesting thing that's happened since I got here. 6 months of talking to myself was starting to feel less like peaceful isolation and more like a psychological experiment I was failing. His ears moved in a gesture she was starting to recognize as curiosity. You chose this assignment? To be alone. The question carried genuine confusion, like the concept was fundamentally alien to him. I did, Nora confirmed, then found herself explaining more than she'd intended. I had complications at my previous posting. Personal entanglements that became professional problems. Being alone seemed simpler than dealing with people and their expectations and all the ways relationships can become messy. She paused. Your people don't value solitude. We find it difficult, Tavriel admitted. Kashari evolved as deeply social beings. Our communication relies partly on pheromone exchange and electromagnetic field resonance that requires proximity. Isolation for us is physically uncomfortable, not just emotionally challenging. The idea that you would choose this voluntarily suggests either great strength or great pain. The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Maybe both, Nora said quietly. She changed the subject, gesturing to her equipment. Want to see what I actually do here? Besides maintain communication systems and slowly lose my mind. Tavriel's enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. They spent the next hours comparing their work, discovering unexpected overlap in their methodologies. Nora showed him the deep space relay systems, explaining how she maintained humanity's connection to the broader colonial network. Tavriel pulled up his own data on a portable device that looked organic rather than technological, displaying the bioluminescent patterns he'd been tracking across Kashari's forests. These formations, he explained, his fingers tracing patterns on the screen, they're not random. The trees communicate through light pulses, sharing information about environmental conditions, resource availability, even threats. It's a planet-wide network that predates any technological civilization. Like a biological internet, Nora breathed, leaning closer to see the intricate patterns. That's incredible. We've been studying Kashari's forests for years, but we never realized they were actively communicating. Because you've been maintaining distance, Tavriel said, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. Understanding requires proximity. Observation from far away only reveals surfaces, not depths. The comment hung between them, applicable to more than just forest study. Nora met his eyes, those large luminous features that no longer seemed quite so alien. Your people maintain the same distance from us. The protocols go both ways. They do, Tavriel acknowledged. We were taught that humans are dangerous, aggressive, that your species spreads across worlds without regard for existing civilizations. That proximity invites conflict. He gestured to the space between them. But you pulled me from a storm, treated my injuries, shared your shelter and your food. These are not the actions of a dangerous species. We're complicated, Nora admitted. Humans can be aggressive. We have spread across worlds, and not always carefully. But we're also capable of kindness, cooperation. We're just. She searched for words. We're just trying to survive and understand, same as anyone. Perhaps that is what our peoples share, Tavriel suggested. The struggle to survive on worlds that challenge us constantly. The desire to understand our place in a vast universe. We have been so focused on our differences that we have missed our commonalities. The solar activity decreased enough that Nora could access external sensors. She pulled up a view of the bioluminescent forest surrounding her station, the trees pulsing with light in patterns that Tavriel had taught her to begin reading. Show me, she said impulsively. Teach me how to see what you see. The morning arrived with clear skies and the uncomfortable knowledge that clarity meant separation. Nora checked her monitors with less enthusiasm than usual, watching the solar activity readings drop to safe levels. The storm had passed completely, leaving Kashari's forests glowing with renewed vibrancy in the dim red sunlight. Beside her, Tavriel studied the same data with an expression she'd learned to read as resignation mixed with reluctance. The conditions are safe for travel, he said, his harmonic voice carrying a flatness that suggested he was forcing practicality over preference. I should return to my settlement before my absence raises concerns. They will have assumed I found shelter, but prolonged disappearance will trigger search protocols. Of course, Nora said, hating how formal she sounded. You have responsibilities. People waiting for you. Unlike her, whose absence would go unnoticed for weeks except by automated check-in systems. The thought settled heavily in her chest. They stood in awkward silence, the easy comfort of the previous day evaporating under the weight of imminent goodbye. Tavriel gathered his few belongings, checking his equipment with methodical attention that suggested he was avoiding looking at her directly. Nora busied herself with unnecessary station maintenance, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind catalogued everything about this encounter she wanted to preserve. Nora, Tavriel said finally, and something in his tone made her turn to face him fully. I want to see you again. Not as accident or emergency, but intentionally. By choice. His ears moved in a gesture she'd learned indicated nervousness. I understand this violates protocols. That both our peoples would disapprove. But these 2 days have shown me that the distance we maintain serves fear rather than wisdom. Relief flooded through her so intensely it was almost painful. "I want that too," she admitted. "More than I should, probably. More than makes sense for someone who came here specifically to be alone." "Perhaps you came here to discover that solitude and loneliness are different conditions," Tavriel suggested gently. "One chosen freely, the other imposed by circumstances or fear." "When can I see you again?" Nora asked, practicality reasserting itself. "We can't exactly meet openly. Both our peoples have made their positions clear about interaction." Tavriel pulled up a holographic map on his device, pointing to a location roughly halfway between her station and his settlement. "These coordinates mark an abandoned research outpost from before human arrival. Neither of our peoples maintain presence there. The terrain is challenging but navigable. 3 days from now, at midday when the solar radiation is lowest." "I'll be there," Nora promised, memorizing the coordinates. 3 days. They stood at her station's airlock, the moment of separation hanging between them like something physical. Tavriel reached out slowly, his long fingers finding hers in a gesture that seemed to transcend their different physiologies. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me that what I was taught to avoid was actually what I needed to find." Then he was gone, disappearing into the bioluminescent forest with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this world in ways she never would. Nora stood at the observation window long after he vanished, feeling the station's silence press against her with suffocating familiarity. But now the isolation felt different, not like refuge but like obstacle. Something to endure until she could cross the distance between them again. The 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Nora threw herself into work, running diagnostics that didn't need running, organizing supplies that were already organized, anything to make time move faster. She caught herself planning what to say, how to explain the tangle of feelings that had developed from 2 days of forced proximity. It seemed impossible that connection could form so quickly, that loneliness could be transformed so completely by one unexpected encounter. But when she set out on the 3rd day, traveling across Kashari's challenging terrain toward the abandoned outpost, the rightness of the decision settled into her bones. This wasn't impulsive. It was necessary. She was choosing connection over safety, curiosity over fear, and the freedom in that choice felt like finally breathing after months underwater. Tavriel was already there when she arrived, standing among the ruins of the old outpost with his characteristic elegant posture. His expression when he saw her approach carried relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "I worried you would reconsider," he admitted as she drew close. "That wisdom would override desire." "I'm not that wise," Nora said, and they both laughed, the sound echoing through the empty structures around them. They walked through the ruins together, talking easily now without the barriers of initial uncertainty. Tavriel explained the history of the place, built by an earlier Kashari expedition to study a unique mineral formation before being abandoned when funding disappeared. Nora found herself relaxing into his presence, the awkwardness of their first encounter completely dissolved. "I brought something," Tavriel said, pulling a small crystalline object from his pack. "It's a memory keeper, traditional Kashari craftsmanship. It stores bioluminescent patterns, like capturing light itself." He demonstrated, the crystal pulsing with the forest's communication patterns. "I recorded the mating display sequence we watched together. So you can carry that moment with you." Nora accepted it with careful reverence, the crystal warm in her palm. "I didn't bring anything nearly that profound," she admitted. "But I loaded some music onto a portable drive. Different pieces, ones I thought you might enjoy. Human emotion translated into sound." They exchanged gifts like children trading treasures, each item carrying weight beyond its physical form. They were acknowledging something neither had fully articulated yet, that this connection was worth preserving, worth the risk of continuing despite obstacles. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. They met at various neutral locations, always careful to avoid detection by either of their peoples. Tavriel taught Nora to read the forest's bioluminescent language with increasing sophistication. She shared human poetry with him, watching him struggle and succeed at parsing metaphor across species barriers. They discovered that laughter translated perfectly, that curiosity was universal, that comfort in another's presence required no linguistic common ground. "This is unsustainable," Nora said one afternoon as they sat among the ruins that had become their regular meeting place. Eventually someone will notice. We'll be discovered. And then what? Both our careers compromised, possibly charges of protocol violation, our people's relationship damaged by our selfishness. Is it selfish? Tavriel challenged gently. To demonstrate that connection is possible? That the fear maintaining our separation is unfounded? He shifted closer, and Nora was intensely aware of the diminishing distance between them. I have been thinking about this constantly. We are not the first to question these protocols, but perhaps we could be the first to actively challenge them. How? Nora asked, though part of her already knew what he was suggesting. Document our interactions. Create a formal report showing that prolonged contact between our species leads to cooperation rather than conflict. Present it to both our authorities as evidence that the current restrictions serve outdated fears rather than present reality. His ears moved in determination. It will be controversial, possibly career-ending, but it would be honest, and honesty seems preferable to this secrecy. Nora considered the proposal, weighing professional caution against the growing certainty that what they'd found mattered more than protocol. We'd be asking both our peoples to reconsider generations of policy based on our experience. That's either incredibly brave or incredibly arrogant. Perhaps both, Tavriel acknowledged. But consider the alternative. We continue meeting in secret, living divided between our official positions and personal truth. Eventually the strain becomes unbearable or we are discovered anyway, and nothing changes except we have wasted time that could have been spent honestly. You make a compelling argument, Nora admitted. She thought about the isolation she'd sought, how it had seemed like solution rather than symptom. How Tavriel's presence had shown her that what she'd been avoiding wasn't connection itself but the fear of connection failing. All right. We document everything. We present it formally. We argue for change instead of just wishing for it. They spent the following weeks creating comprehensive documentation of their interactions. Scientific observations of successful interspecies cooperation. Cultural exchange notes showing mutual understanding development. Personal logs acknowledging the emotional dimensions neither could deny. It was thorough, honest, and absolutely terrifying to contemplate actually submitting. Are you afraid? Nora asked the night before they planned to send their report to both human and Kashari authorities simultaneously. Terrified, Tavriel admitted. But also hopeful. Fear of change is natural, but remaining static when change offers growth seems wasteful. He reached for her hand, the gesture now familiar and comforting. Whatever happens, I do not regret this. You have shown me that isolation was preventing discovery. That the boundaries I accepted as necessary were actually limitations I could choose to transcend. Same, Nora said softly. I came here to escape connection. You taught me that connection is actually what makes isolation bearable. That belonging doesn't require being the same, just being willing to understand. They submitted their report at dawn, a joint communication to both Human Colonial Administration and Kashari Cultural Council. Then they waited, sitting together at the abandoned outpost that had become sacred ground, watching Kashari's forests pulse with their ancient light language. The responses came within days, far faster than either expected. Nora's supervisor contacted her first, his expression cycling through shock, concern, and something that might have been grudging respect. This is unprecedented, he said carefully. Also potentially catastrophic for diplomatic relations. But it's also the most compelling argument for protocol revision we've ever received. The Council wants to meet with you both. Formally. To discuss implementing trial contact programs. Similar news came from Tavriel's people, cautious interest mixed with traditional concern, but willingness to consider new approaches. It wasn't immediate acceptance, but it was possibility, which was more than either had dared hope for. They stood together under Kashari's sky weeks later, preparing for the first formal interspecies conference. Around them, representatives from both peoples gathered with visible uncertainty but also unmistakable curiosity. The boundaries were beginning to shift, not disappearing but becoming more permeable, more thoughtfully constructed. We did this, Nora whispered to Tavriel. We actually changed something. We demonstrated what was already true, Tavriel corrected gently. That connection serves understanding better than distance serves fear. That two beings from different worlds can find common ground if given opportunity. He looked at her directly, his large eyes reflecting the bioluminescent glow surrounding them. That sometimes the most profound discoveries require abandoning the safety of isolation. Nora squeezed his hand, feeling the rightness of his words settle into truth. She'd come to Kashari 7 seeking solitude, running from the complications of connection. Instead she'd found Tavriel, found purpose, found the courage to argue that understanding required proximity rather than distance. The protocols were changing slowly, carefully, but genuinely. And at the center of that change stood two surveyors who'd been caught in a storm and found each other in the shelter. Above them, the forests sang their light language, patterns of communication that had preceded any civilization and would continue long after. Nora had learned to read them now, to see the planet as Tavriel saw it. And he had learned to hear human music, to understand emotion expressed through sound. They'd built their own language across the gulf between species, proved that difference was no barrier to understanding. The conference began, voices from both worlds tentatively exploring new possibilities. And Nora knew, with certainty beyond logic, that this was just the beginning. That what she and Tavriel had started in isolation would grow into something larger, something that proved fear was no foundation for peace. They'd chosen connection over protocol, honesty over secrecy, and in doing so had drawn a new constellation in the space between their worlds. One that shone with the light of possibility.